Hello and welcome to By the Book. This is your host, Joe Hebert. We're continuing a series on Machiavelli's Prince, and today we'll be talking about chapters 7, 8, and 9. So previously we saw that Machiavelli wrote this book, The Prince, for future generations, and in it he's giving us the knowledge that he has gained over his lifetime, both theoretically and practically, about the nature of the actions of great men, as he puts it. And what makes a man great? Well, since human nature is essentially about acquisition, about acquiring what we desire, greatness for Machiavelli is maximizing acquisition. And this especially applies to those who desire power, empire, and glory. And so his book is going to be a manual for obtaining those things. And also Machiavelli himself wants to attain those things through writing this book. So we see that the art of acquisition requires ruthlessness. The first lessons that he teaches us in The Prince are the necessity of betraying your allies, not just your enemies, but your allies who are your future enemies. Why? Because they're your competitors. Anybody whom you identify as a competitor has to be eliminated. As we go through the book, we see that this means both individuals, it means their relations. If there's any kind of hereditary rule, you have to eliminate their family, their bloodline, as he puts it. He also applies it to aristocracies and to republics. In a republic where people are used to governing themselves, you have to wipe out the entire society, basically. You have to plunge that society into chaos so they'll forget their customs and their habits of self-governance. So there's a tremendous amount of ruthlessness that he is recommending for the sake of acquiring power. Now, there's two obstacles to that we see coming early in the book, which are, in a sense, going to give us the actual drama of this book. How do you overcome these difficulties? And the first one is just morality in general. Morality, of course, would counsel us against betraying people, especially our allies, to whom we owe things. And so Machiavelli uses the Romans repeatedly as an example. And he says, well, the Romans, they always said that they had a justification. They always justified what they were doing, but they always did the thing that would maximize their power. And they always had an excuse. So instead of morality, Machiavelli wants to replace morality with excuses. So you can't just openly do stuff that's evil, but you're going to do whatever it takes to get power. And then you have a good excuse for doing that. The deeper problem, in a sense, or the more particular problem, because that would be more the innate problem of if you have a conscience, but the more particular problem to his time period is the church. As we see in early examples, because the church has spiritual authority, this complicates things on earth because it means princes cannot have sole authority over their people. They have to share authority with somebody else. As we saw before, competitors have to be eliminated. So what do you do about the Pope in particular he's concerned about, but the church as a whole? What do you do about the church being a power that's a rival that is going to put limits on your power? But you apparently cannot apply these lessons to the church, because if you're eliminating and bloodshed and all that stuff against the church, you're going to be designated as evil. How are you going to justify that? How could you do like the Romans and have an excuse for that? So finally, we see in chapter 6, where we left last time, that Machiavelli's greatest heroes in history are these men like Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, and Theseus, who established empires that continued to grow after they died. And so these men actually had more power after their death than before. What was a key to that? Well, a key to that was that they are what he calls prophets. They didn't just take earthly power, but they actually established power over how people think, what people believe. And he actually goes as far as saying that they're armed prophets, so they're forcing people to believe in some system that they have given them. Now, we saw that he hems and haws about Moses being on the list. The upshot of that is that, in Machiavelli's view, part of what it takes to succeed at that level is to be reputed to be divine. That is, that you have to be considered a god or somebody who talks to God or somebody who has relations with God. That's part of how you get this kind of control over people's thinking and establish this kind of power over a length of time. However, Machiavelli suggests that Moses is really no different from Cyrus, Romulus, and Theseus, implying that either they all talk to God, which is not likely, or that none of them really talk to God. So we can see a tremendous implication of Machiavelli's teaching here of how he is trying to teach us to think about religion in a way that undermines its authority, right? But we see it's not a complete rejection of religion on his part. If religion is a useful tool of obtaining power, then the goal is not to eliminate religion, but to establish control over religion. So this is an important qualification, as we saw that he has this opposition to the Catholic Church. What does he want to do about that? He doesn't want to eliminate religion, but he wants to establish control over religion. So with that thought in mind, going into chapter 7, let's look at chapters 7, 8, and 9 and see if we can see any progress in Machiavelli's thinking about how would you obtain control over religion. So chapter 7 is about new principalities that are acquired by others' arms and fortune. And right away we can hear alarm bells ringing, because we've already seen that for Machiavelli, virtue or excellence is having control over things and relying on yourself. Relying on others, relying on fortune or chance is the definition of vice, according to Machiavelli, weakness. It's not virtuous. So this is something to bear in mind, because this chapter is going to feature a figure whom many people consider to be Machiavelli's hero, Cesare Borgia. And we'll see there's some evidence that Machiavelli admired Cesare to a certain extent. And he definitely wants us to learn some things from Cesare. But we have to be clear that this chapter makes it abundantly clear from its own title. This is not a chapter about virtue and success. And in fact, Cesare is going to fail. And failure is the only sin for Machiavelli. So let's keep all that in mind. Cesare is, he can teach us some things, and there's important things to learn from him. But he ultimately fails, and that's what we most need to learn from this chapter, is how not to fail the way that Cesare did. So we can see from the beginning why Cesare was up against some difficult challenges. In chapter 6, Machiavelli had said that men like Moses, who achieved the most, had started with nothing, and the fact that they had nothing, to work with, just allowed their virtue to manifest itself. That they could establish total control over a situation that seemed hopeless. Now here we're looking at persons who have a state given to them by somebody else. And so they're relying upon chance and they're relying upon other people. And Machiavelli says these are two very inconstant and unstable things. He's reminding us this is not the way to succeed, by relying on others. And so he uses some almost poetic imagery here about roots and branches and so forth. And he says this is not going to last. This is like trying to plant a garden or whatever, and you're not letting the roots grow, and it's not going to produce the fruits that you want. But he gives us an interesting twist on this, where it might be possible to rescue this, and this is where we're going to see that Cesare becomes interesting to Machiavelli. Okay, because Cesare, he says, he had so much virtue. So was he relying on chance? Well, he had his power through chance, but he had the virtue. So what was he going to do? He wanted to lay the foundations after getting his state, after getting his power, that others would lay before getting power. So this is a really interesting thing with virtue. If you're virtuous enough, not only could you start from nothing and then obtain power, but you could have power given to you in an unstable way and then lay your foundations to make it stable afterward. So how would you do that? Well, again, we will learn some things from Cesare, but Machiavelli's next statement here shows us that, again, if you look at the big picture, Cesare still fails. He acquired a state through fortune, and he lost it through fortune. So despite Machiavelli's praise of his virtue and his encouragement for the idea that you could try to lay foundations afterward, it did not work. He did not succeed at laying those foundations. So he obtained and lost his state through fortune. That's the essential moral of the story. But Machiavelli now makes excuses for him. Well, it wasn't his fault, because it was extremely bad luck. We'll see, later he talks about some of the details of that. But bear in mind that Machiavelli has already taught us that virtue conquers fortune, and he's going to only hammer that harder through the book. So the fact remains that Cesare clearly did not have enough virtue to overcome this extreme malignity of fortune. But why is this important? Remember, Machiavelli describes himself as suffering from an extreme malignity of fortune in the dedicatory letter, and he's painted a picture of European politics as being just ridiculously hopeless, that nobody can consolidate power anymore like the Romans did in the old days. So it's not just Cesare who's suffering from this extreme malignity of fortune, it's Machiavelli and his readers. From his own point of view, we're in a horrible situation where nobody can get politics right. So Cesare's struggle and failure are going to be very instructional for us, because they're going to show us the sort of thing we should be doing, but we're going to have to do it better than Cesare did. So before I proceed, let me just say a couple things about these historical figures so we know who we're talking about here. Cesare Borgia was an Italian duke, and we're going to see a few of his exploits, so we don't have to get into that here. But what else is interesting about him, though, is his relationship to his father. His father, Pope Alexander VI, one of the most famous or infamous of the Renaissance popes. And he, as we're going to see, he was a pope who did not always behave in the way that's expected of popes. For example, he had a son, Cesare, who obviously Machiavelli says the vulgar called him Valentino. That was just a little joke because he was an illegitimate child. Valentine's Day gift, and as the people were joking. So, but Alexander, who was Pope, he loved his son, Cesare, apparently, and he was working with him, working closely with him to build an earthly empire of some sort. So this raises a very interesting question about the church. How could you solve the problem of the church interfering with politics? One thing that we've looked at, you could try to get rid of the church, right? But another thing that would be interesting in light of the people in chapter 6 who combined religious and secular authority, what if you used the church to build an empire? Then the church wouldn't be in the way of the empire, right? Because it would be based on the church. So Machiavelli, even though he's certainly not a fan of the church, it doesn't mean that he would have any compunctions about using the church to build an empire if it would work. If that were a viable option. So that's another interesting thing about this story, because you have a pope who is being pretty Machiavellian. And so what does Machiavelli think about that? Is that a possible path to success as a Machiavellian prince? But notice that his focus is on Cesare, even though, as we're going to see, it's Alexander VI who really had the upper hand in this whole story. Well, why is that? And why does it really not work out for either of them in this story? So the first thing that Machiavelli tells us is that, first of all, it's Alexander VI, the Pope and the father, who decided to make his son the Duke great. That's what he had said before. The Duke gets his power by fortune and he loses it by fortune. But here he tells us about the difficulty that, Alexander saw the difficulty, which is that he as the Pope had many enemies in Italy. So, the Pope, Machiavelli is looking at the Pope as an earthly prince who happens to have spiritual authority, which is either convenient or inconvenient, depending on who you are. And certainly it's convenient for the Pope. However, the Pope has rivals like any other prince. And so this was part of what he was doing with his son, Cesare, is that he came up with a plan not only directly himself to try to fight some of his rivals, but through his son to try to do that. And Machiavelli gives us a formula which is very important, which is, earlier he had said men like Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, and Theseus, they had to find the people in trouble in order to rescue them to get that kind of glory. But Machiavelli is going to show us a different trick starting in this chapter, which is if you happen to inconveniently find that people are not in trouble and they don't really need your help, well, one way that you can gain power is to cause trouble and to create chaos, and then you can be the one to rescue them from that, right? Then that's what it means not to rely on fortune, because you can't just hope and wait for there to be a problem that you can fix. If you have to be the problem fixer to get power, then if necessary, you might have to create a problem and then fix it so that you can get power. So now Machiavelli goes to the Duke. How is the Duke going to carry out this plan, which, as we saw, originated with his father? But the Duke is pretty on board and pretty virtuous in a Machiavellian sense. So there's two things that Machiavelli gets into here. First of all, he identifies, a couple of the groups, the parties who are a problem for Cesare and his father, the Orsini and the Colonna parties. Okay, we're not going to get into details of that, but this goes back to what we saw before, that you have to eliminate rivals. So you can't literally just, of course, eliminate everybody. So as we get deeper into this book and we look at these strategies, we're going to see that a very important part of the Machiavellian strategy is sort of like the metaphor of surgery, right? Surgery is not just randomly cutting somebody. It's very precisely cutting in order to achieve a very particular goal. And Machiavelli is going to use that kind of logic for eliminating rivals, that you have to eliminate all rivals, but you also don't want to be eliminating people who are not rivals. So we're going to increasingly see him make this kind of distinction. In this case, some of the members of these parties are gentlemen who can be bought with money. Okay, so if somebody is of the character that all they really care about is who's paying the best wages, then the easiest way for you is not to eliminate them, because that's unnecessary bloodshed, and you can't eliminate everybody, right? So if you can buy somebody off, that's a better way to do it, as long as you know that this is a person who can be bought off. It's not somebody who desires power so much that they're going to come after you regardless of what you're paying them. Right? So that's the key distinction. So with those gentlemen, he can buy them off. But with the heads, that is, whoever he identifies in those parties as they're in it for the power and they're not going to give up unless they have power, he has to dispose of them. He has to eliminate the heads. Now, how does Cesare eliminate the heads? Interestingly, Machiavelli does not get into the details of how he does that here. But Cesare uses a strategy which Machiavelli will go into in detail very shortly in the next chapter, and we want to note that because Machiavelli is deliberately, I think, putting several people who use the same strategy packed close together in this part of the book, because he's really trying to insinuate something about the importance of this strategy. And the strategy was quite simple, is that if you know that there's X number of people, say 20 or 80 or whatever, that you need to get rid of, that could be a heck of a campaign to go after that many people and assassinate them, right? So a very convenient trick is you have a meeting of some kind. And of course, you have to use a lot of deception. And Machiavelli emphasizes that in these stories, that you have to really convince people there's a good reason that's worth their while to come to this meeting. And then during the course of this meeting, you have to quickly, suddenly, have your assassins come out and eliminate all of your enemies literally in one swoop. So, in 5 minutes, all of your enemies are gone and it's over. That's an additional aspect of the surgical nature of the violence that Machiavelli recommends. You don't want, if you can avoid it, you don't want some long, protracted campaign of assassination that's just going to create all kinds of turmoil in society. You would like people to wake up one morning and just hear that all of these heads are gone, and they're gone. So, there's nothing anybody can do about it. You're the only one left who really wants power and is really willing to do what's necessary to get power. You're the only one they're left with at that point. So Cesare did that, and that's a very virtuous thing from a Machiavellian point of view. Now, another thing that Cesare does, this is a side story, but we can't skip it because not only does it so well illustrate Machiavellian logic, but it also, I think, gives us an important hint about what Machiavelli is doing in this book. And this is an important part of the book, and I think he might be hinting about what he's up to in this book as he gets into this part of the book. And that is that one of the territories that Cesare is taking over is the Romagna, and it was a lawless territory. Part of that was, in fact, because, as we saw before, his father, Alexander, and Cesare thought, we're not going to be able to take control unless we sow some chaos. Well, now there's chaos there, but how can you rule a territory that's chaotic? If it's too chaotic, they won't obey anybody, including you, right? So he had to reinstill law and order into this territory. But how is he going to do that? Because, coming into a territory where people are used to breaking the law and making them obey, they're not going to like that. And you're potentially going to make, new enemies this way. So here's how he did it. He found a man, Ramiro de Orco, a cruel and ready man, Machiavelli calls him, and he gave him the fullest power. Said, just go in there, crack heads, do whatever you have to do, get these people in line. And it didn't take him long. In a short time, he establishes peace and unity with the very greatest reputation for himself. In other words, everybody hates this guy because he has been rough on everybody, but nobody wants to cross him because they're afraid of him. So that's a good result, right? What do you think that Cesare is going to do? Oh, thanks, Ramiro. Appreciate it. Give you a gold star. Let's find out what he does to him. Well, Cesare thinks, now everybody hates Ramiro, and everybody is all wound up. So he wants to purge the spirits of that people. And also, he wants them to obey him, Cesare, not Ramiro, right? I mean, I don't know if Ramiro is going to be a rival, but that's a possibility. But at the very least, Ramiro is going to be competing for his loyalty or affection, not affection, but, respect with these people. And he wants to also make it clear to them that, if this man was cruel, if this man was harsh, that wasn't my fault. It wasn't because of me, Cesare. That was just his doing, right? Of course, that's not the truth. The reason he sent Ramiro there was precisely to do that. But here's what he does. Having seized the opportunity, this is the virtuous thing, right? Seize your opportunities. He has Ramiro placed one morning in the piazza in two pieces with a piece of wood and a bloody knife beside him. So what is the message here? What exactly is the message? It's a very important message, which Machiavelli doesn't spell out in words. He says the ferocity of the spectacle left the people at once satisfied and stupefied. This is a very important passage because Machiavelli talks about in this book the satisfaction of desires. And as we're going to see, he makes clear that satisfying the desires of the people is very important. He wants the people to be satisfied. But is that in some kind of loving, compassionate way? Well, here we get one very important piece of evidence. He wants the people to be satisfied and stupefied, speechless. In other words, he wants the people to be satisfied in some kind of a passive way where they think, okay. And what exactly is the message? The message is, if this man was rough on you, it wasn't me. Don't blame me for it. But at the same time, he's not trying to act like he's some kind of super nice guy, and then the people might not fear him, right? They might not fear Cesare if they thought, he's just a pushover compared to Ramiro. So he simultaneously appeases their hatred of Ramiro by killing Ramiro, but also communicates to them, don't mess with me. Look what I did to my friend, the man who did the job I asked him to do. Look what I did to him. You think I'm not going to do that to you if you cross me? So the people remain fearful and they remain obedient because they don't want to mess with Cesare, but they don't hate Cesare because he never actually did anything to them personally. So this is a perfect win for Cesare, and of course it involves deceit and betrayal and murder and just an ingenious kind, but from a moral point of view, you could almost say sickeningly ingenious. But from Machiavelli's point of view, this is just the height of virtue, to be able to see how a series of bad deeds can get you to be respected and obeyed in the best possible way without making enemies. Now, what else? Other thing I want to say about this is that this shows the importance of working through other people, and of course maintaining control over that, so you're ready to then discard them when they're not useful anymore. But think about Machiavelli, who's trying to obtain power through writing a book. He's not himself achieving power over anybody. So is this not sort of an admission on his part that part of his strategy is he literally has to get other people to do his dirty work, because he's not going to be doing any of it himself. And by writing this book, he's going to inspire other people to do this stuff. But is it really for their benefit? Does he really have a prince in mind? Some prince who reads this book is going to become, glorious and everything. Or to what extent are the people who read this book and implement it simply going to be tools for Machiavelli himself to get his system of politics, his ideas of politics implemented? And how much does Machiavelli really care about what's going to happen to those people? This is one of the passages that would really raise a question about that. So skipping over a number of details here, again, the conclusion of the story is that Cesare fails, and he fails because his father, the Pope, dies prematurely in terms of their plans. Cesare happens to be sick at the time. He's not able to act quickly enough. A bunch of things go wrong, and Machiavelli says, it's just really bad luck, But again, Machiavelli doesn't believe in relying upon luck at all. So as we look here, we're going to have to see that Machiavelli is actually analyzing this to find out exactly what did he fail to do. And in this passage, he identifies, breaks down 4 things that he needed to do: eliminating his rivals in the political parties. Yeah, he succeeded at that. To winning over the gentlemen in Rome. Yeah, he had made significant progress on that. But where did he fail? The third point, I think, is really important to focus on here, the College of Cardinals. Because up till now, we've talked about the church and the Pope. But, what is the Pope? Where does the Pope come from? He's not a hereditary prince, right? The Pope is elected by the cardinals of the church. The cardinals, we've already seen, are very important church officials that the Pope himself will appoint. This was one of the signs that Louis was lacking power in France, is that he couldn't decide who was going to be cardinal in Rouen, for example. The Pope was going to appoint him, and he had to bargain with the Pope over that to get somebody that he was happy with there. Okay, so and here's how it relates now to Machiavelli's concerns about the church. If you're trying to get rid of the church, like he was implying before, you can't just kill the Pope, because the cardinals will come together and elect a new Pope. And then the first item on the agenda is going to be to go after you, who killed the previous Pope, right? So, but also we can see that from the inside, if you're trying to use the church to build an empire, this is also a problem, because the cardinals typically will elect somebody who's relatively old, who will therefore have a relatively short time in the chair of Peter. That's exceptions to that, but it's pretty typical. And so it's not a pure accident that Alexander dies, halfway through this plan, because that's kind of how the church usually works. Popes wouldn't usually have enough time to do this kind of stuff. And that's maybe part of the design of how things are done in the church, right? It's obviously the church is not meant to be a way of establishing an earthly empire. So Machiavelli might be interested in using it that way, but he can see for himself that it's a nice idea, but there's like an institutional problem here that would make that really hard to do with this institution. But it raises the question, just like we saw in chapter 3, what do you do about the Pope? Well, by logic, you would have to get rid of him, but how could you do that? This is a different version of that. Okay, what did Cesare have to do? He had to control the College of Cardinals, But how could you control the College of Cardinals? I mean, these are men from all different countries who gather together to elect a pope. Um, but, that's an interesting thing to think about, right? Let's take a look at his further comments. Now, it would be very difficult, if not impossible, to try to actually control the College of Cardinals when they get together to elect a pope. And Machiavelli's comments seem a little bit mysterious on this. He says that one could only accuse Cesare of having messed up in the creation of Julius as pontiff. That's whom they elected next, and it didn't go well for Cesare. But he says Cesare made a bad choice, but it wasn't Cesare's choice, right? It wasn't his choice that they elected Julius. But Machiavelli makes a mysterious comment. He says that although Cesare could not make a pope to suit himself, he couldn't control the cardinals to the extent of just selecting who was going to be the next pope and for his own convenience, but he could have kept anyone from being pope. Now, there's a couple ways we could take that. Machiavelli could simply mean that he could have, vetoed anybody that they were trying to elect. Exactly how he could have done that, it's not very clear, right? I mean, how could he have exercised a veto power over the College of Cardinals? I think there's another possibility, but before we explore that, let's just note the final concluding words. The Duke erred in this choice of Pope Julius, which again wasn't his choice, but he erred in this. He made a mistake, and it was the cause of his ultimate ruin. So without a clear explanation, Machiavelli makes clear that he judges Cesare to have been a failure, and it was his fault. He made a mistake, but he doesn't tell us very clearly exactly what that mistake was. So I just want to go back to what I mentioned before, which was that earlier Machiavelli did not give us a lot of detail about how did Cesare take care of his enemies, the heads. But I mentioned that it was in fact by staging a meeting, and then during the meeting he had them all assassinated in one fell swoop. Now, in next chapter, we're going to see that there's two people that Machiavelli talks about who use that exact same strategy. And in that chapter, Machiavelli is going to call it a crime, which we'll see is very important, that it's labeled as a crime. But three times in a row, he tells us about people who use this tactic. And right in between those three stories, he has this mysterious thing. He could have kept anyone from being pope. So how could Cesare have kept anyone from being pope? Well, in order to elect a pope, the cardinals all have to get in a room together, okay? And they get in that room together for a purpose. So with a little bit of deception and a little bit of planning, couldn't that same tactic be used on the cardinals of the church? You could eliminate all of them in 5 minutes. And then what would happen to the church? There wouldn't be a pope, and there wouldn't be cardinals to elect a pope. So where's the church going to go? Where's the leadership? Where's the headship going to come from? This is, I think, what Machiavelli is saying. Let's think about this. Not that that's his actual plan. It's not necessarily his final plan. But he wants us to think about, would that be possible? Cesare maybe could have done that. Now, what would have come next? The next chapter that's going to come up is actually going to specifically show us, what that might look like. And as we're going to see, it's problematic. It's not necessarily the final solution that Machiavelli is going to look at, but he wants us to think through this possibility that you could take over the church, eliminate the church, or take over the church through some kind of surgical mass murder. So in chapter 8 is about those who have obtained principality through crimes. Is this coincidental, or is this following this thread of, in order to defeat or take over the church, you would have to commit some kind of crime like this? Well, Agathocles the Sicilian is one of the examples that Machiavelli gives, and he achieved power through an act of mass murder, mass assassination. And Machiavelli makes clear from the title of the chapter and from the discussion that, well, it was a crime. Now, does this mean that Machiavelli objects to it? Well, as we're going to see, we've already seen that Machiavelli defines virtue as anything that works in acquiring power. And he doesn't care if it's moral or not. So he's not calling this a crime in the sense of, oh, how could you do that? That's wrong. Okay. And here he talks about the virtue of spirit that Agathocles has. So we can sense a tension here. Machiavelli calls it virtue to do whatever it takes to get power. Now, crime seems to be a successful strategy. He's actually, Cesare did this and it worked. Agathocles did this and it worked. So what's wrong with it? There is, in fact, something wrong with it, but it's not because Machiavelli has a moral objection. It's going to have to be a practical objection. There's a practical limit to what you can do with this kind of, criminal violence. Now, here's the problem. The practical problem is that you can't call this virtue. Now, this is deeply ironic because Machiavelli actually has been calling it virtuous to do this kind of thing, and he's still going to call it virtuous to do this kind of thing. It's not saying Machiavelli can't call it virtuous, because he is. But he's saying in society, you can't call this virtue. Okay, so even though morality is skin deep, morality still has to be taken into account. Like you said about the Romans, they always had a justification for what they did. And with Agathocles, for example, he never comes up with a justification for what he did. He just does it, and then he takes the power. And Machiavelli says, well, that's fine, but the thing is that by doing that, he was labeled as a criminal. And even though people obeyed him, this is specifically the problem. He says, with this kind of behavior, you can acquire empire but not glory. So you can get power while you're alive, but once you're dead, your power is gone because nobody believes in you. Nobody reveres you, like Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, and Theseus. I mentioned in the discussion of Moses that, after the golden calf episode, Moses used violence against his own people to get them in line. But was he labeled as a criminal? No, because he did that on behalf of God. So this is a crucial distinction that Machiavelli is getting at. It's not that the techniques are wrong. It's just that if you do this without a justification, you'll be labeled as a criminal, and then you will never be able to achieve glory. You'll never be able to have power after you're dead, which is the goal that Machiavelli is after. So it doesn't mean don't do this kind of thing. It means don't do it without a justification. So what kind of a justification could you use for such a heinous act of, say, for example, assassinating all the cardinals of the church or something like that? How could you possibly justify that? This is going to become, I think, the real, crux of the book, the real nugget of wisdom that Machiavelli is trying to disseminate in this book. How could you justify? Because the techniques, they're very well known in history, but the specific problem of the Catholic Church is a kind of a new problem, right? So there has to be some solution, and the solution is going to have to be at least somewhat new. And chapter 9 is getting us a major step towards seeing Machiavelli's solution to this problem. How to oppose the church without being labeled as a criminal for doing so. And it's on the civil principality. So it might look like this is only a certain type of regime that he's talking about. But I think we can easily see by now that Machiavelli is not a political scientist trying to catalog regimes. That's not. There's a message. There's a plan that he's plotting in this book, and he's using these kind of categories to advance his planning and his plotting. So. What about the civil principality? Well, a civil principality, he means, is when somebody comes to power with the support of the people. So this is the first time that he's going to make a clear distinction between two different humors, as he calls it, that is, two different dispositions within human nature. We saw before that everybody is acquisitive, according to Machiavelli, but here he's going to officially tell us there's two types of acquisitiveness. And it's very crucial to understand whom you're dealing with when you deal with another human being. Are you dealing with one of the people who desire neither to be commanded nor oppressed? Or are you dealing with one of the great who desire to command and oppress? So it's interesting that there are only two types of people: those who want to command and oppress, and those who don't want to be commanded and oppressed. People who want to be left alone, and people who want to control others and not leave them alone. So there's two humors or dispositions, and they're both selfish, and they directly conflict with one another. So what is Machiavelli going to do with this distinction? Let's look at this. Well, there's something, it seems like a hopeless, conflict within human society, but Machiavelli says there's a golden, silver lining to this, because the people, when they see that they cannot resist the great who want to oppress them, they will fall back on Plan B, which is they're going to give the reputation or the power to one man and make him prince so as to be defended with his authority. So this is what's convenient for the prince. Now, the prince is obviously one of those great, right? He's one of the people who wants power. So he could be an enemy of the people himself because he wants what they don't want, which is he wants to oppress them, and they don't want to be oppressed. But the solution for that is to say, well, don't consider me to be one of these great people who wants to oppress you. Consider me to be your defender against these great people who want to oppress you. So all of my power is no longer going to offend you, because I'm using my power to protect you from all these other horrible people who want to rule over you. Never mind the fact that I'm just one of them, and I want the same thing they want. So this is obviously a deceptive tactic, but Machiavelli thinks that this tactic is highly successful. That the key to being a successful, great, man is to distinguish yourself from the other great men or groups, and to say they're oppressors. They want to oppress you. All I want is to protect you from them. So here Machiavelli talks about why this alliance between the prince and the people is so perfect. Because he says, as we've already seen, you can never satisfy the great. They're your competitors. They want the same thing that you want. And they have endless desires that you're never going to be able to satisfy. But you can satisfy the people. Remember, before he had said the people were satisfied and stupefied by Cesare. You can satisfy the people because all they wanted, is to be left alone. And as he'll elaborate later, when you take power, you can be surgical about that as well. You can take the power that you need to have control over society, but it doesn't mean you have to micromanage everything that everybody's doing, and it doesn't mean that you have to rob people of everything that they enjoy in life. So we'll see later how he makes those distinctions, but the point here is that you can portray yourself again as the defender of the people against the great, and that will satisfy the people. That will make them feel protected and make them feel like they have what they desire, which is to be left alone. And you don't have to fear the people because, first of all, they are the people. They don't desire power. They're not going to come after you. As long as you are not offending them so badly that they're desperate and they'll do anything, then they're not ever going to be a threat to you. Whereas if you did offend them and went against them, they're always going to outnumber you. They're always going to be an endless problem. But if you have them on your side, then everybody else is going to be afraid to come after you because they're going to be isolated against the whole crowd who supports you. So here's where we see that Machiavelli is not just saying this as one category of rule or regime versus another, but Machiavelli draws a universal lesson from this, which is that even if you happen to come to power with the help of the great, you should switch. Remember Cesare, laying his foundations afterwards? This is another example of that. You come to power on the backs of the great, you should betray them and you should become the defender of the people against the great. That's going to give you a much better basis in the future for your power. And Machiavelli wants to emphasize this point so much that he brings up a proverb. Remember, it's very rare for Machiavelli to bring up counter arguments, and he never does it in a fair way. But here he mentions a proverb that says, founding on the people is founding on mud. But Machiavelli says, no, that if you are a man full of heart, you know what you're doing, you're a virtuous man, you can use the people as the most secure foundation of power. It's because you're not expecting anything out of them except not to oppose you. And you can safely expect that from the people because they are not great. They're not ambitious. And you're not expecting anything else from them. You can do your own dirty work of ruling, and all you need from the people is that they'll be satisfied and stupefied. They're going to leave you alone to rule, and they'll be satisfied with your excuses and your justifications that you give them, especially when you tell them that you did it for them. They will appreciate that, and they'll leave you alone. And the final words I want to look at here in this chapter, the wise prince must think of a way by which his citizens always, in every quality of time, have need of the state and of himself, and then they will be always faithful to him. So there's nothing sentimental about this. And we mentioned before, Machiavelli may have some kind of Republican leanings. He may favor a Republican government in the long run, but it's not in some sentimental way. He talked about how to destroy republics if that's what you need to do to get power. He is bringing in a certain Republican flavor into the prince, but by teaching that the prince, even though he's a monarch, we're thinking about a monarchical figure, the prince should establish himself as the protector of the people, and that's how he's going to justify his ruthless actions. So how would you apply this to what we've seen before? We've seen that the biggest problem for Machiavelli is what do you do about the church? And how do you get the church out of the way? And we can see here the basic strategy that Machiavelli will employ for this is that if you go after the church, the only way you can justify this is by saying you're a defender of the people. And therefore, you're going to have to portray the church as one of the great who is trying to oppress the people. That is going to be the key to success for Machiavellian politics. The church has to be portrayed as the enemy of the people, as an oppressor, as an institution that is there to hurt the people. And on this basis, the prince is going to be able to oppose the church and do what he has to do and justify it in a way that the people will accept.